Photography is recognized to such a degree in our army that no preparations would be considered complete unless every requisite of the art was at hand.
That was the Photographic News in 1878, commenting on the British Army's affection for the camera. During the last century, when poverty was the best recruiting sergeant, the camera followed the men who took the Queen's shilling to stand guard across the vast empire. The officers were gentlemen who practiced the profession of war, but were amateurs of many other arts, including the novel pastime of photography. The officers came from public school corps like the Eton Rifles, and from as early as the 1850s, cadets bound for India were also being taught to shoot with cameras. Today, the British Army trains its young officers at Sandhurst, but it also trains officers for other armies, those of its former colonies. It's a legacy of a time when the British Army conquered, then policed the greatest empire in the world, an age of almost continual colonial war with some 50 campaigns in as many years. After the shambles of the Crimea, the British Army was reformed and made more efficient. And its officers, fortunately for us, took to the newfangled photography with great enthusiasm. So today, we're still able to put together a picture, a fascinating picture of an imperial army going about its business overseas. At one time, every third ship in the sea was British, and the Royal Navy ruled the oceans of the world. Roger Fenton photographed the fleet drawn up for review as it entered the second half of the century and the era of the most rapid imperial expansion. It fell to the British sailors to patrol the sea routes which held together the outposts of this empire. Even the Mediterranean was dominated by the British from their fortress at Gibraltar and their naval stronghold in the island of Malta. The opening of the Suez Canal then brought swift and secure passage to the richest prize of all, the Orient. John McCosh was an officer with the army in the East and a pioneer photographer. Perhaps it was the early calotype process he used with his soft paper negatives, which make his portraits of his brother officers so striking. McCosh took his camera with him when the British invaded Burma in 1852. Photography, said McCosh, was of special interest to the army officer in the East.
During the course of his service in India, he may make such a faithful collection of representations that would be a welcome contribution to any museum.
And one Governor-General of India, Lord Canning, a keen photographer himself, encouraged his officials to make just such a record as they travelled up and down the continent. Within a few years, they had amassed 100,000 pictures, the best of which were published in 8 volumes called The People of India, the first ever study of its kind. This is a monument to the event which shocked the British out of the belief that the subject peoples actually welcomed the imperial presence. In 1857, in Cawnpore, the British garrison, men, women and children, were massacred. The mutiny of the Indian sepoys serving with the British lasted for 18 months. A record of the destruction was made by a professional photographer who had recently covered the Crimean War, Felix Beato. At Lucknow, Beato found a courtyard still littered with the bones of nearly 2,000 Indian soldiers, slaughtered in just a few hours by the avenging British. The mutiny was suppressed with great ferocity, and the leaders publicly hanged. Those regiments, like the Sikh cavalry, who had stayed loyal to the British, were soon dispatched on another imperial adventure, a second opium war with China. Again, Felix Beato travelled with them to photograph the campaign. The force disembarked across miles of mudflats and camped at the first line of forts, which were abandoned. Inside the forts, the Chinese had left behind their antique wooden artillery. The invaders went on to take the Taku forts, which guarded Peking. Photography in 1860 was still too slow to capture the action itself, but Felix Beato composed pictures of the wreckage and the Chinese dead, which must rank as the earliest surviving attempt to show the reality of war. Peking was forced to submit, and the British merchants continued to trade in opium, addicting millions of Chinese and hastening the disintegration of the ancient Celestial Empire. But the true imperial concern was the consolidation in India of the Raj, a rule secured by tens of thousands of British soldiers. These common soldiers lived an austere life. They were little better off than the 200,000 or so Indians who served in the same army. British sergeants at least had their own mess rooms, and perhaps only sergeants would have had the group discipline to hold such a determinedly casual pose for the camera. The officers lived a life apart, their privilege set against that historic duty to which Kipling gave voice. Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed, go bind your sons to exile to serve your captives' need.
As the Victorian age advanced, the British came to rule over a quarter of the human race. And they brought to that role a sense of mission which was almost religious. The most important attribute for that ruling class was what they called character, that peculiarly English blend of personal bravery and social conformity, and an ability to endure in the most trying outposts of empire. They also displayed an incorruptibility which was quite rare among European colonialists. And with all this went an effortless sense of superiority. In the words of a leading politician of the time, the world was growing a little more English every day.
The interest the officers took in photography has left their way of life in India well documented. Some of the most relaxed studies were made by Henry Wood of the Rifle Brigade. Starting in the 1860s, the Major used his cumbersome camera with its heavy glass plate negatives to record the detail of domestic life. The Wood family albums show that there was, in the days of the Raj, one corner of the foreign field that was briefly England. This charmed life unfolded in the golden afternoon of Britain's greatness. But Henry Wood's photographs reveal an existence quite surreally distinct from that of the other India. These pictures were taken by Willoughby Hooper of the Light Cavalry during the famine in Madras in 1877, when 6 million died. The victims are arranged in a macabre parody of the group pose of an English portrait studio. That same year, Queen Victoria was proclaimed Empress of India. But to the north of India, the imperial expansion met strong resistance in the mountains of Afghanistan. When the British invaded in 1878, the campaign was covered by a professional photographer from the Punjab called James Burke. The army usually gave Burke transport and rations, an honorary rank, and a fee. In exchange, they got 6 prints of every photograph for the military archives. British military muscle, now strengthened by the machine gun and quickened by the electric telegraph, soon forced the Afghans to negotiate. As the leader rode into the British camp, the photographer Burke was on hand to record the event. The treaty signed with Yaqub Khan allowed the British a military mission in the Afghan capital of Kabul, but they were massacred a few months later. When the British returned for revenge, the photographer again went with them. They seized the forts overlooking the Khyber Pass, then marched on Kabul. There they captured the Afghan artillery and dug in for the winter, besieged by hostile mountain tribes. The ragged war went on for months before another settlement was patched up and the British withdrew, with little gained. The Army's own full-time photographers were men of the Royal Engineers. The sappers started training in the military uses of photography as far back as 1856, just after they returned from the Crimean War.
The generals back at the War Office in Whitehall weren't interested in pictures of soldiers in action. The army camera was to copy maps and plans for officers on campaign. And their official photographers, the Royal Engineers, got their first chance to work in the field because of the incompetence of the army's neighbours here in Whitehall, the Foreign Office. You see, King Theodore of Abyssinia sent a letter to Queen Victoria, and when she didn't bother to reply, Theodore, being a volatile fellow, grabbed 60 Europeans and held them hostage. Now, it turned out that his letter had simply been mislaid by the Foreign Office, but by that time it was too late.
An expeditionary force landed in the coast of Egypt in 1868 and prepared to march into Abyssinia under the command of General Napier. 6 engineers and a sergeant, with 2 sets of photographic equipment, made 15,000 copies of maps and documents on a strict budget of £447, 6 shillings and 9 pence. But the sappers also took the chance to photograph other scenes along the route of march. As King Theodore retreated, the British fraternized with the local people, and some, like Captain Speedy, went native. When the British army caught up with Theodore, he suddenly released the Europeans who had been held hostage for 3 years. But Napier pressed on and took the royal family prisoner. This is the infant prince, heir to the throne. Rather than surrender, Theodore shot himself in his fortress at Magdala. The sappers were sent in to take a souvenir picture of the dead king, but by the time they reached the top of the rock, Theodore was already buried. It was left to the Zulus to deal the British the worst blow ever suffered at the hands of a native people in Africa. The Zulus were seen as particularly noble savages, fierce, strong, and graceful, a romantic stereotype reinforced by the photographers. In 1879, at Isandlwana, the disciplined Zulu regiments destroyed a British column of 1,600 men. The subsequent attack in Rorke's Drift was beaten back, but the only record we have is of the ruins and the graves of the defenders. When the British counterattacked at Ulundi, they finally broke the power of the Zulu nation. The Zulu king, Cetshwayo, was captured and brought by boat to London, where he found himself transformed into a celebrity. When this portrait was taken at Bassano's studio, Bond Street was packed with cheering crowds. By the time the British came to subdue Egypt and the Sudan, photographic techniques were rapidly improving, and photographers accompanied the force which set off up the Nile to confront the dervishes, the wild tribesmen who had killed General Gordon at Khartoum. The dervishes engaged the British at Atbara, and the pictures of Scottish soldiers burying their dead are attributed to a Guards officer, the Honourable E.D. Loch. When the armies finally met at Omdurman in 1898, the British guns began to cut down the tribesmen at a distance of 2 miles. The dervishes advanced to the slaughter with great courage, but the British killed 11,000 of them for the loss of only 48 dead. By now, enough war photographs were being taken to allow the incidents in such an encounter to be recalled in sequence. the looting of the dead, the prisoners of war being led away, British generals leaving the field carrying the enemy's standard, and the reoccupation of Khartoum, where the Union Jack was hoisted ceremonially above the ruins of Gordon's old palace. A young officer in that campaign was to become one of the most celebrated war correspondents. But at Omdurman, Winston Churchill charged with the cavalry.
I am sorry to say that I shot 5 men for certain and 2 doubtful. Nothing touched me. I destroyed those who molested me and so passed out without any disturbance of body or mind.
Winston Churchill made his name in the last imperial conflict of the 19th century, the Boer War. Churchill covered the war as a correspondent. He was captured, he escaped, the newspapers made him into a hero, and he returned to the front for the highest fee then paid to a reporter, because wars sold newspapers, and the Boer War coincided with the rise of the popular press and the picture magazine. Consequently, an enormous number of photographs were taken by both sides, and in them we can begin to see the styles of modern photojournalism taking shape.
Horace Nichols, a professional photographer, followed the British retreat to Ladysmith in the first months of the war. His pictures capture the somber atmosphere of the retreat of the mounted Leicesters. But the magazine Nichols worked for dropped him in favor of a newspaper man. Some professionals posed their photographs for greater effect, with one eye on the popular market. Some are quietly sentimental. Others are rather romantic. And some try to create a more journalistic appeal. Many photographs were heavily retouched with pencil to sharpen the outline and so counter the coarseness of the mass production press. But photographers like the German Reinhard Thiele could also produce a realism which drained any glamour from the conflict. Such pictures are the forerunners of modern photojournalism. Another factor emerged in the Boer War. For the first time, the British faced an enemy who could also use the camera as a weapon. The Boers circulated their sympathizers abroad with propaganda pictures of British dead. These are the victims of the British defeat of which Churchill wrote.
The scenes on Spion Kop were among the strangest and most terrible I have ever witnessed.
The setbacks in South Africa were the military symptoms of the approaching eclipse of Britain's global preeminence, of the age when its soldiers held together the largest empire the world has ever seen. It now seems an unlikely chapter in human affairs, but fortunately, the camera stood witness to it.
In the next episode of Camera, World on a Plate, Gus MacDonald tells how the early camera crossed deserts, mountains and polar wastes to become the travelling eye of a public eager to view the wonders of a rapidly expanding world.